feel free to use the chat window that we have. Let me make sure the recording is started. Yeah, I see the recording is started. Wonderful. So thank you everybody for taking out time and joining us on today's session. Today's session is slightly different than the normal webinars that we do. Today's session is primarily focused on giving you a live demonstration of setting up a Windows virtual desktop environment on Microsoft Azure. My name is Roshan. I'm your host for today's session. I work as a solution architect with Ingram Micro. I'm based in Melbourne. I work in a national role, so I do help partners across Australia. My main expertise is Azure. I've been working on Azure for the last 6-7 years now, primarily infrastructure as a service. And during the entire session, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat and post your questions. These are some house rules, so please make sure you mute your microphone during the session. At the end of the session, I'll give the permission to open up your microphone and ask your questions. Please post your questions on the Teams chat so we can combine all the questions and share the question and answers with all the attendees. All the questions will be answered towards the end of the session. I'd like to complete the demonstration first and then take up all the questions that you have. And if any questions requires me to show a piece of the demonstration again, I'll be more than happy.
Roshan, I think you're on mute. We've lost audio.
Oh, I'm very sorry for that. I've been talking for the last 10 minutes. Okay, I hope everybody is able to hear me now. Kim,
yes.
can you confirm
yes,
that?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. So let me begin again. So thank you everyone. Apologies for that small technical glitch. I was on mute, not noticed that. So today's session is an hands-on lab for Windows Virtual Desktop. I'm your host, Roshan. I work as an Azure Solution Architect with Ingram Micro Australia. I'm based in Melbourne, but I work in a national role, so I help partners across Australia, right from Perth to Melbourne to Adelaide, Sydney, all these various locations. Today's session is slightly different. We'll primarily focus on setting up Windows Virtual Desktop in a live demonstration and not cover a lot of slides. Before I go through the entire session, I request everybody to please be on mute during the entire session. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Teams chat. We have coordinators on the Teams chat who can help you with any audio video issues. If you have any technical questions, these questions will be answered by myself towards the end of the session. So the agenda looks pretty simple and straightforward. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So a couple of slides about Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. What are the requirements? What are the prerequisites to set it up? And what are its features and functionalities? Then we'll jump on to an overall architecture in terms of how my lab is set up, which I'll be using for the demonstration. I'll also show you some options in terms of how you can integrate your on-prem Active Directory with Windows Virtual Desktop. This is a webinar series of 4 sessions. So today I'll be covering how you can integrate a normal Windows Active Directory with Windows Virtual Desktop. In the next session, I'll be talking about how you can integrate Azure Active Directory domain services with Windows Virtual Desktop. So it's not a repetition of the same session. It's a continuation of the various scenarios that you'll see across all the 4 sessions that we have planned every Wednesday. We'll jump on to the live demonstration, and at the end, we'll look at the question and answers. So for people who are new to Windows Virtual Desktop, it's a desktop as a service offering from Microsoft Azure. This was introduced last Ignite by Microsoft. It's the only Windows 10 multi-session offering available in today's market. Whether it is Citrix or VMware Horizon, if they need to offer a multi-session Windows 10 experience, then they have to use Windows Virtual Desktop in the background to offer it. Right? It's the Microsoft is only offering it currently. No other competitor is offering this. It definitely is optimized for Office Pro Plus. In the demo, you'll see I can configure Outlook, I can configure OneDrive on my Windows 10 virtual desktop. And it uses advanced technologies like FS Logic, where all the user profile data is stored separately outside the Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. If you do have customers who would like to use Windows 10 after the extended, after the end of support, which was, if I'm not wrong, on January 14th, then Windows Virtual Desktop is the only supported platform where they can host and run Windows 7 and still get extended security updates. Windows Virtual Desktop is also very much integrated with the advanced security features of Microsoft 365. You can use things like conditional access. You can use Active Directory auditing. You can use multi-factor authentication for users. So all these features can be combined, and you can give a very secure and a complete online solution for your customer, especially during these times where every company is encouraging people to work from home. Having a secure infrastructure and having the infrastructure running on Windows 10, which is probably the most popular operating system, everybody knows how to use it, just makes the life of an end user and the IT admin much more easier. We'll look at what is pooled and personal desktops. This is something that's available in Windows Virtual Desktop. Pooled desktop is combining multiple virtual machines or virtual desktops onto a big fat server. Personal desktops is giving dedicated resources for each and every user or a set of users. So both these type of configurations are possible within Windows Virtual Desktop. So if you have a customer of, let's say, 25, 30 users, and you want to make sure that the CEO, the CIO gets virtual desktop, but with dedicated resources, and rest of the users, you would like to share a big set of resources with all the remaining users. So this is possible. So that's the difference between pooled and personal. Pooled is sharing of resources, personal is dedicated resources. Windows Virtual Desktop is easy and simple to deploy and scale. You'll see in the upcoming live demonstration that it's not very complicated in terms of deploying a virtual desktop infrastructure. Customers who are eligible for Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, these are the customers who already have the Windows 10 license with them, which they can potentially reuse with Windows Virtual Desktop. So if your customer is using any of the Microsoft 365 plans, so if it is E1, E5, F1 business, or even education licenses, then they basically have the Windows 10 license covered, which they can reuse on Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. So this becomes a very good upsell story that you can go ahead and position to your existing Microsoft 365 customers. If your customers are using Office 365, then one option is you can upsell them to Microsoft 365, or they will have to buy the Windows 10 as a subscription license separately and use that with Windows Virtual Desktop, right? For customers who are on M365, they don't need any additional license. For customers who are on Office 365, any plan of Office 365, and who are not willing to upgrade to Microsoft 365, they'll need to purchase the Windows 10 license separately. The second section is about server workloads. So for whatever reason, if your customer wants to run a Windows Server operating system on Windows Virtual Desktop, he can still do that. But in terms of RDS CALs, he will require RDS CAL with software assurance. He cannot use the existing RDS CALs which he has. He will need to purchase RDS CALs with software assurance if he wants to deploy a server workload and not a Windows 10 operating system on Windows Virtual Desktop. So what are the requirements to set up Windows Virtual Desktop? You would definitely require an active Azure subscription, and rest of the components are within the Azure. So you will definitely need to deploy a virtual network. We'll need to have an Active Directory infrastructure for Windows Virtual Desktop. Windows Virtual Desktop cannot run in a workgroup environment. So when it comes to Active Directory, there are two options. One, you can use the traditional Active Directory, which runs on a Windows virtual machine in Azure, or you can use Azure Active Directory domain services. Right? Today's session, we'll focus on using an Active Directory running from a Windows machine as a virtual machine. In the next session, we'll look at how to use Azure Active Directory domain services with Windows Virtual Desktop. We definitely need an account in order to enable and publish and configure Windows Virtual Desktop. So the account that I'm using has global administration role on Azure. It is the owner of the Azure subscription. It is also an administrator in my Active Directory, and multi-factor authentication is disabled for this particular user. So these are the permissions that you will need in order to set up a Windows Virtual Desktop, or the account to which you would use to set up a Windows Virtual Desktop. These are the permissions that are required for it. So this is what my lab setup looks like. Pretty simple and straightforward. I have an Active Directory role running in my Azure virtual machine. This Active Directory role also has Azure Active Directory Connect, which is used to synchronize the roles and users and groups from my Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, right? I also have a file server on which I will be storing my user profile data, or user profile containers is what they're known as. And in the same environment, I'll also be setting up a Windows Virtual Desktop session host. So this is what the overall lab setup looks like. Very simple, very straightforward. You can use this lab setup for small customers, anywhere from, let's say, 5 users to about 20 users, 25 users. You can definitely use a similar lab setup deployment for them as well. If you have an Active Directory on-prem, then you can still use that with Windows Virtual Desktop. So what you have to do is you have to enable Active Directory replication. So on Azure, you can set up an additional domain controller on a virtual machine. You can synchronize that with Azure Active Directory and make sure you have an Active Directory replication via the site-to-site VPN. So this is another deployment strategy that you could use for slightly bigger customers who have Active Directory on-prem, who would like to use Active Directory on-prem for their other applications, in-house applications, but still would like to reuse that with Windows Virtual Desktop, and they do not want to go through the route of domain services, right? So this is another way of how you can use. Most of the components are again deployed on Azure, and you can definitely set up an environment like this as well. So the overall deployment steps. So I just wanted to list down the steps here. The presentation and the recording will be shared with everybody who's attending the session, so you don't need to make a note of it. So we'll make sure your Active Directory is up and running, your DNS settings are all updated. We'll check the permissions. We'll also make sure the file server. So in this session, I'm using a file server, a Windows VM file server to host my user profile data. You can, in the next session, I will show you how you can use Azure file storage to host your user profile data, right? So there are different ways and combinations of components that you can use to set up Windows Virtual Desktop. So in each session, I'm using different components so that you can learn as much as possible in terms of how to set it up. Check the permissions, give consent for using Windows Virtual Desktop, assign a particular role called tenant creator so that it has the permissions to create Windows Virtual Desktop tenants. We'll create the tenants using PowerShell. There are certain commands today that you have to run via PowerShell as part of the setup. So we'll run those commands and we'll see what those commands do. Then we'll create a Windows Virtual Desktop host, assign users. Now, one of the additional steps which I'm not covering as part of today's session is in today's session, we'll only be covering how to deploy a Windows 10 desktop infrastructure. We will not cover how to also do application publishing as part of this particular session. We'll again cover it in the upcoming sessions because I'll need to set up 2 host pools and each host pool creation takes about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll configure FS logic and store the user profile containers on file server. Then we'll log in and test and we'll see how the experience is. Okay, so let's jump onto the demo. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Kim, John, can you confirm if you're able to see the screen sharing?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So this is my Azure infrastructure or Azure environment. If I look into the virtual machines, there are certain components which I've already set up so that we can cover most of the deployment in the time frame that we have. So I already have an Active Directory running in a virtual machine. I have a file server deployed. For testing purposes, I've already deployed a Windows Virtual Desktop session host, but we'll redeploy this so that you know all the steps. I'm sure everybody knows how to deploy an Active Directory infrastructure. So if I show you my Active Directory here, so this is my Windows Server, Active Directory running on it. Let me just resize it again. So here I have my Active Directory role. So my domain, I've named it as virtualsolution.club. So this is the, let's say, the fictitious company that we're using today. I have an OU called company and I've created 3 users. MS Dhoni, Rohit Sharma, and Virat Kohli. So these are the 3 users that I have as part of my session. MS Dhoni, who's also the ex-India team captain, cricket captain, is a domain administrator as part of my organization. Right, so I've given him the domain rights. I'll be using his account to set up most of the activities in my lab. And the same machine also has an Active Directory Connect running on it. It's typically not recommended to have Active Directory and Azure Active Directory Connect running on the same machine. It's ideally recommended to run on 2 different machines, but since it's a lab and a demo infrastructure, I have it running on the same, and I have it running configured. It is syncing just the company organization unit, and it runs every 30 minutes. So if you see the sync cycle, it keeps syncing my Active Directory with Azure Active Directory every 30 minutes. So pretty simple, straightforward Active Directory setup, nothing very complicated about it. If you look at my Azure domain, I've registered my domain here. So virtualsolution.club is registered and verified in my Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and all the 3 users are also synchronized. For example, if I go to users and search for Dhoni, you'll see the user is synchronized, right? If you see the source, it says Windows Server Active Directory, right? Which means this user is actually coming from my Active Directory. Now, for MS Dhoni, I've assigned the following roles. He's the global administrator. of my Azure tenant. And if I go to my subscriptions, you'll also see that he also has owner permissions on my on the Azure subscription itself. So I go to my subscription, and here if I check for Dhoni, he has the owner permissions, right? So the permissions are in place. Active Directory syncing with my Azure Active Directory, that's in place. The last item to check, and this is something that people miss out, is to make sure your DNS is up to date, right? Because your file server, your Windows Virtual Desktop should be able to communicate with your Active Directory, right? So if I go to my Active Directory here and go to the networking of it, so I'll just go ahead and open the subnet or the virtual network and just check that my Active Directory DNS is up to date. Now, my DNS is running on 192.168.1.4. This is the same IP address of my Active Directory, the Windows VM Active Directory, right? So this has to be updated. Make sure the virtual network in which you deploy your file server, your Active Directory, and your Windows Virtual Desktop, the DNS is updated. By default, it is the first option Azure provided. But since your Windows Virtual Desktop has to communicate with your Active Directory, the DNS has to be updated. So make sure this is in place. Let me also quickly go through the file server as well. It's a pretty simple, straightforward file server. It's just Windows Active Directory, Windows Virtual Machine. It has a C drive, a D drive, and it is domain joined as well. So I've made sure this machine is joined to the virtual club domain. So all the machines are part of the domain, and we have all the prerequisites now available. Right. So let's start off with the first step. The first step is you have to give a consent to Windows Virtual Desktop service that you want your subscription to use Windows Virtual Desktop. Now for that, you have to go to idweb.windowsvirtualdesktop or wvd.microsoft.com. This is the web page, standard web page, publicly accessible. And here you'll have to go ahead and enter your directory ID or Azure Active Directory GUID. So how do I get that? If I go back to my Azure subscription, go to my Azure Active Directory, you see the tenant ID. Right, so I'll just copy this, go back here, and the first one I'll select as server app, the consent option. I'll put in the subscription, the tenant ID, hit submit. Let me redo it again. So it'll ask me to sign in. Now, while you're signing in, you have to sign in using the account that has the right permission, right? The account that has global admin permission and the owner, and is also the account that has permissions on your local Active Directory. So in my scenario, that's Dhoni. So I'll select that. I'll enter his password. And you get a permission acceptance page. So I say I accept. So we have done it for the server app. We have to redo it for the client app as well. So on the consent page, select the client app, the same tenant ID again, submit. We'll choose the account and accept that we are okay for the clients also to access the Windows Virtual Desktop clients also to access the subscription. Okay. Wonderful. So the first step is giving consent. Now, once the consent is being given, then you have to go ahead and give the account tenant creator permissions. So come back to your Azure Active Directory, and now if you go to your enterprise applications, you will see Windows Virtual Desktop available as one of your enterprise applications. So go ahead and open it up, click on it, and here If you go to users and groups, you will see that MS Dhoni now has default access, but you have to give him a tenant creator access so that he can go ahead and create a Windows virtual desktop tenant, right? So for that, you have to say add user.
Roshan, can you minimize the pop-up
Try to redo that again.
on the right? Put that down.
Users and groups, add user. So I'll select the user here, which is me, and hit select. Right. So one user selected role tenant creator, hit assign. Right. So now if you see here, Dhoni now has the tenant creator role. So now we are all ready to go ahead and start creating our Windows virtual desktop infrastructure. Now, as of today, there are certain steps that you have to run on a PowerShell to go ahead and create your Windows virtual desktop infrastructure. These steps will soon be available on the user interface. Microsoft is already creating a Windows virtual desktop management console or a management plane within the Azure portal itself. But as of today, it's not yet available for all the users. So let's use our PowerShell. So this is the traditional Windows PowerShell that you have. Just launch it as an administrator. The very first thing that you'll have to do is install the PowerShell module for a virtual desktop. So I've already have some of the commands available here. So the first command is to install the module, which is microsoft.rd infra.rd PowerShell. So I'll just run this, make sure the module is installed. Let's say trust everything. Next, I'll import the module. Okay. The next one is I have to associate the right RDS account for the deployment, right? So in my scenario, the account again is the account which has the right permissions. So I'll need to log in using the account with global admin and owner permissions. Okay. So now using this account, let's start with the deployment or the creation of the new RDS tenant. So what I'll do is I'll just search for new RDS tenant. So this new tenant, the options to create is it needs the tenant ID, which I've already updated here. It needs the subscription ID as well. Now, how do you get the subscription ID? If you go back to your Azure portal, go to your subscriptions. You can copy the subscription right from here, right? So this is the subscription ID. So to create an RDS tenant or Windows Virtual Desktop tenant, you need the tenant ID and the subscription ID. So just copy both of them and update it here. I've already updated it, and give a name for your RDS tenant. So I've given it WVD S1. I'll just append it with demo. So it's Windows Virtual Desktop Session 1 demo. That's the name of my RDS tenant, and I'll hit run, right? So give it a couple of seconds. This will go ahead and create our new RDS Windows Virtual Desktop tenant. So as you can see, confirmation, the tenant name is Windows Virtual Desktop or WVD S1 demo, right? So these are the steps that you have to run in your PowerShell. Now, once this is successful, now you go back to your Azure portal and just search for Windows Virtual Desktop. You will get an option saying Windows Virtual Desktop provision a host pool. So provisioning of a host pool is, in simple English, setting up your terminal server in your on-prem, right? The server which will actually host your virtual machines. That is what a host pool is all about. So I'll go ahead and create. So there's a whole wizard that we'll have to go through. So select the right resource group. Now the resource group should have the Active Directory, the file server, everything should be part of the same resource group and should be part of the same region as well. Now the region which I'm using currently is Southeast Asia, right? The reason I'm using Southeast Asia and not Australia is because currently I'm based in India right now. I'm delivering the session from India. I needed a location which is close to Australia and close to me so that I don't see a lot of latency. That is the reason I'm using Southeast Asia. In your, if you're based in Australia, if your customer base is in Australia, then either select Australia East or Australia Southeast, and that should be all right. So make sure all the resources, whether it is Active Directory, network, your file server, and your host pool, all of these are in the same region. We'll give it a host pool name. So we'll try to maintain the same terminology. So I'll say WVD S1 demo host pool. So it's easier later to remember it. So here's the desktop type, the one that we discussed, pooled or personal, right? Pooled means a bunch of users sharing the same infrastructure. Personal means every user gets his own desktop infrastructure, right? In this session, we'll use pooled. Default desktop users, let's say we'll put in Tony at virtualsolution.club, and we'll give Kohli as well. These are the two users who are currently part of my local Active Directory, have been synchronized with Azure Active Directory as well. Now, the way you add multiple users is by a separate, the separation is a comma. Do remember you cannot add a group here. That is still not available. Hopefully it gets available in the near future. You cannot add a group. You have to add users individually. Okay, as of now. The service metadata location is United States. Now, people tend to get confused saying that, hey, why use United States? Why not have Australia? Now, do remember, service metadata does not include any user data. It does not include any Windows virtual desktop data. It is just letting Microsoft know that, okay, this is a subscription which has Windows virtual desktop enabled in it, right? This service metadata location is being rolled out to every region as we speak. But as of now, it's only Windows, it's only United States. But you can be rest assured that there is no customer sensitive data or any data which is part of your Windows virtual desktop being shared. It is just sending the information of this subscription has Windows virtual desktop enabled. That's the information that is being sent. Next, we'll configure the host, which will host our virtual machines. So we have some user profile options here: light, medium, heavy, power. You can always use custom. So I'll go with light. I'll say in my environment, I just have 5 users, right? So for 5 users, it is giving me an option to select a one standard DS4 V3. Now this is a default recommended option, but you can always go ahead and change the size, right? One of the beauties of Windows Virtual Desktop is all the virtual machines available within Azure is available at your disposal. So right from A series, B series, D series, N series, all these virtual machines are available to be used. I have customers who have actually deployed N series. N series virtual machine actually have the ability to give you a GPU as well. So for customers who work on Autodesk or Revit or Adobe Creative Cloud, and they need a desktop which has graphics enabled processing in it, then we can use that as well. That's one of the very important case studies that you can potentially use Windows Virtual Desktop with and save a lot of cost for your customer. Instead of he buying a $5,000, $6,000 laptop, he can pretty much set it up in a couple of hours on Azure and use it whenever required. Next, we just have to give a prefix to our host pool machine. So swan demo VM, right? So we'll just give it a name so that we can understand what it is for. Next, we'll go to the settings. Now here is where you select your image. Now you can use custom images as well. You can upload your own image into the blob storage and use that. You can put in your image URL. Microsoft gives a bunch of its own images. We have a Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session with Office Pro Plus. What this means is this operating system allows multiple users to log in, and it already has the Office Pro Plus, which is your Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, OneDrive, all these already installed on the operating system. So it's the image that I would be using. You have different options available as well. You can just use a Windows 10 multi-session without the Office. So in our session, we'll use Windows 10 Pro Plus. With Pro Plus disk type, I'll leave it to premium SSD. Now the Active Directory that we need to join using a UPN. So that is again the UPN that we would need to use is the UPN with the right solution. Sorry, the right permission. So what this does is this lets Azure know that this is the domain that you have to join this Windows Virtual Desktop to, and Dhoni is the user account that has the permissions, which lets you join the Windows Virtual Desktop host pool to the Active Directory. Right? You can give specific OUs. I'll leave it to default, and here you have to select the right network under which the host pool can communicate with your Active Directory. So my Active Directory is running in 192.168 subnet. So I make sure I select the site right virtual network and the right VM subnet. The next is the Windows Virtual Desktop groups. So here, the Windows Virtual Desktop tenant group name, we'll leave it to default. The tenant name. So the tenant name that we created was WVD S1 demo. So we'll have to mention the same name here. Do make sure that you use the right naming convention and use exactly the same name and the same account details once again here. Okay. So do make sure you do not, this account does not have multi-factor authentication enabled. Now there are customers who always require the admin to have MFA enabled. If that's the scenario, then you will have to use service principal names. Again, how do you create a service principal? How to use it? That is something I'll be covering in the upcoming sessions. For today's session, I'd like to keep it simple and straightforward. I've just made sure that this account doesn't have MFA enabled on it, and hence I'm using the same account. So let's review our entire infrastructure. So our resource group is right, region is correct, the host pool name, the default desktop users. So again, I'm just creating desktop infrastructure. I'm not creating application pool infrastructure. Now for, sorry, not application publishing infrastructure. For creating application publishing infrastructure, it's the same. There's no difference at all. You have to run through the same wizard once again to create and just give it a different name, right? Instead of the same name being used here, give it something like app pool, right? And you have to run through the same wizard once again. So currently a single user cannot be assigned to both, or you cannot have one app pool, one host doing both application publishing and desktop publishing. You need to have two separate host pools for it. Hopefully in the future that gets removed, but as of today, you'll have to create two separate host pools for app publishing and desktop publishing. So I'll click create. Now this roughly takes about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes of time for it to get created. While it is being created, let me quickly check if there are any questions. Does the user set up every time they spun up? No, the question from Philip is, with WVD, does the user need to set up Outlook every time? The answer is no. You set up once, and every time he logs in, his Outlook and his OST file is available. I'm not sure, not if you use FS Logic. I'm not sure what the question is here. Director at CIA Ops, if you can rephrase your question. Can you send us the presentation video and PDF doc? Yes, after the session, you will receive that. Okay. Great. So keep your questions coming up. So what I'll do is just to keep the time frame in mind. I've already created this infrastructure. This, as you can see, it takes through about 6 steps to create the infrastructure. So what I've done is I've already created the same infrastructure here. So once it is created, this is how the pool desktop looks like. So it is running on 192.168.1.5. It's running in Southeast Asia. I'm using 4-core, 16 GB machine. It's the same users have been assigned to it. And all those things have been set up, right? So we'll use this just to make sure that we are able to complete the session in the time frame that we have. Now, once you have created your host pool successfully, the very next step is to log into this host pool and configure FS Logic, right? Now, if you do not configure FS Logic, what happens? All the user profile data will get stored on this server. It goes into the server which you just created on the C drive of it, right? Like the traditional terminal server, right? The entire logic of using FS Logic is to make sure you separate your user profile data, store it on a separate shared location, and it makes the management of the data much more easier because you can back up the data, user profile data separately. When you scale, let's say today you have one host pool, tomorrow you add 2 or 3 more host pools as your users increase. These user profile containers can dynamically attach to any host pool that the user logs into, right? So it's very dynamic for an end user. He just feels that he is logging on to a Windows 10 machine. He doesn't know what's happening in the background with respect to what's FS Logic, how is it using, how is it saving. For the user, end user, it's pretty simple, straightforward, and very seamless. The other benefit of Windows Virtual Desktop is you do not need to open any incoming ports. If you see the networking here, no incoming ports are opened for this network security group, right? So how do I log into this particular server? What I typically do is I either log into an Active Directory or the file server and then log into my Windows Virtual Desktop session, right? So I have my file server available here. So what I'll do is from here, I'll log into my Windows Virtual Desktop. So within the same network, within the same subnet, of course, you will be able to communicate an RDP to the machine. It's just that you'll not be able to do it from a public IP. Okay. So for installation and configuration of FS Logic, you'll have to do this on your Windows Virtual Desktop host machine, right? Now, again, there are certain steps of FS Logic that are not very straightforward. For example, you'll have to make changes to the registry settings. So you have to be very, very careful. Always take a backup of your registry and then do the changes for it. Okay. So to begin with, what I'll do is I'll first need to download my FS Logic application. So you can either copy it to the machine or the machine also has internet permissions. So all you need to do is just open up the browser and have it downloaded. Now, just to keep the time frame in mind, again, what I've done is I've already downloaded the FS Logic application, and I've already have it saved onto this particular server. Okay, so if you see downloads, I've already downloaded. Oh, it's not showing up here. So let me see if I've already downloaded in another location. Let us quickly download it. So FS logic. So when you go to this article FS Logic profile containers and Azure files, you will see a link to download it, or here it is. You can go ahead and download this particular FS Logic application, and once it is downloaded and installed, then you'll have to go ahead and make changes into your registry settings, right? So to open, go ahead and open your registry editor, go to your local machine, software, and you have FS Logic, right? So I've already installed the FS Logic container. So here, what you'll have to do is you will have to create a new key. So go ahead and create a new key called profiles, which I've already created. You see here the profiles is already created, so this will actually error saying the name already exists. So I'll just go ahead and delete this, and within this you'll have to create one D word and one multi-string value. So the D word is enabled and multi-string value would be VSD locations. So enabled basically tells that FS Logic is enabled, and Windows Virtual Desktop location or VHD location, sorry, virtual hard disk location basically says where is your user profile container being stored, right? The other items, you don't need to create them. I've just created for the demo purposes so that I do not have any local profiles created. So if you would like to make sure that at any given point you do not want to have any local profile on the same machine, there's another registry setting that you can add. But the most important ones are the D word, which is enabled, and the multi-string value. So the D word is new and D word, and multi-string value is new multi-string value, right? And here you'll have to put in a file location, which is a shared file location. Now I'm using Windows Virtual Desktop file server, and I've created a folder called containers. It's a simple folder within the file server. I'll show you after this, once I minimize this window. It's a simple folder, and this folder has permissions to all the users, right? So these are the two D words. So FS Logic today, the configuration is slightly complicated because you'll have to make changes to the registry settings on the Windows Virtual Desktop session host. But once you do it a couple of times, and hopefully Microsoft gives us an option to make these changes using the wizard or a simpler way of doing this in the near future. So this is my file server, and if you see here, I've created a folder called containers, right, in the C drive, and this folder is currently shared. So this is the same structure that this is the same location that I'm being used, and the permissions which I've given is, permission is for Dhoni, I've given full control, and even for Kohli. So any user profile data, any user profile data, if it is being stored on this location, all those users should have access to this location. Okay, that's the most important piece. So if you have a group, then you can definitely add a group here. So make sure all your users are part of the group and add that group, give them full control. If the user does not have access to this particular folder, which is configured as part of FS logic, then the user profile does not get created and will be forced to get created on the local server itself. Right. So make sure on this folder, the full control permission is given to each and every user whose user profile data will be stored. Okay. So once this is configured, updated registry setting, all we have to do next is just log in using our session. So there are two ways to log into Windows Virtual Desktop. One is using the web client. So I'll show you both the options. I'll show you a web client and I'll show you the downloadable client as well. Let me just launch it using incognito mode. Web client. Okay. So on the web, what I'll do is I will log in as Kohli, and in the client, I will log in as Dhoni, and I'll show you why is it a multi-session Windows 10. Right? So once I log in, if everything is in place in order, I should be able to see the desktop using which I should be able to launch. Yeah, I can see that here. So if I double click this, I'll say allow, and this is a normal Windows Explorer. I'm sorry, I'm using Google Chrome, but this will work pretty much in any browser which is HTML5 compliant. Okay, so now I'm logging on to the desktop, right? So okay, so as you can see, his profile just got loaded from the FS Logics container. I'll make this full screen so that you're able to see the entire Windows Virtual Desktop. So this is the Windows 10 experience that Virat Kohli is seeing. It's the same Windows 10. He can configure his Outlook. So this is the first time he's logging in. So his Outlook will ask for the first time configuration. He can go into his Word, create Word documents. He can even sign in with his Office 365 credentials. So I have Office 365 license assigned to this user. Right, and the same for Outlook as well. So if I say connect, his OST file will get created, his Outlook will get synced, and this is the very first time, right? So it does not happen every time you log in. Right. So while this is happening, device management. Okay, so I think since I'm on VPN, it's my organization has not allowed VPN configuration, but let's see if it goes ahead and still configures it. Yeah, as you see, Office 365 has been added successfully, and my Outlook profile will get created in a minute. Right, and this is the Windows 10. So you have Virat Kohli logged in here, right? So it's the same experience that he gets on a normal. Now, if he logs out, logs in back, his Outlook profile does not need to be reconfigured again and again. It's a one-time configuration. And the good part is all this data of his user profile is being stored in the user profile container. I'll show you the container as well. Now let me also download. Now Windows Virtual Desktop has a very special RDP client. If you just Google or Bing search for Windows Virtual Desktop client, then this is the client that you can download, hit subscribe, and here I will log in using Dhoni. Solution.club. So when he logs in as well, you will see the same Windows or the desktop icon available in his client, right? So the other one is also created. So you see WVD S1 was the one that we are using, but this was the one that we actually started in the creation, and it is already created now. So I can actually potentially log into this as well. So if I log into the existing one where Kohli is also logged in, and if you had, let's say, if you also have applications published, those applications will also appear here, right? Right. So now Dhoni is also logged in to his Windows 10 virtual desktop. Now, as you can see, his Outlook, his configuration, I'm sorry, this is, yeah, here it is. So his Outlook, his configuration is completely different, right? And if I go to the task manager, you will see there are two users or three users. One is the local admin and Dhoni and Kohli are logged in, right? So this is how we can find out that this is a Windows 10 multi-session environment where multiple users are logged in and are using it. Okay. So this brings me to the end of the session. I hope it was not too confusing. There are certain steps that you have to do in PowerShell. There are certain steps that you have to do on registry settings. Ingram Micro is now offering a 30-day POC environment, funded environment. If you have a customer who's interested in Windows Virtual Desktop, and I can actually help you set this infrastructure, a similar infrastructure for you at no additional cost, right? So if you do have a customer interested who wants to start using Windows Virtual Desktop, feel free to drop us an email. We'll be more than happy to get in touch with you and help you set up the infrastructure and make sure it's working. If you want to add additional machines, for example, if your customer has a custom SQL Server application which he wants to access from Windows Virtual Desktop, we can do that. All we need to make sure is it is part of the same network, part of the same domain, and we'll be more than happy to help you set it up. So we are running a promotion, 30-day POC fund for Windows Virtual Desktop, and we will help you with the implementation of it as well. So that pretty much brings me to the end of the session. I'd like to quickly review the questions that we have. Okay, so any questions? Presentation. Can you also send pricing as well? Now, pricing actually really depends on your infrastructure needs, right? So it's very difficult to go ahead and give you the pricing as a generic price. So if you can drop us an email with your requirements, with the number of users, what do they want to achieve out of Windows Virtual Desktop, then we can definitely help you putting together a right quote and the right price. The file server, does it have to be a proper server or can it be a storage? Now it can be a storage, but it currently the storages that are supported are the file server, like a Windows virtual machine, an Azure file storage. If you know different types of storages available in Azure, you have Azure file storage, disk, blob, queues, and tables. So file storage is also supported. Blob is also supported, but I typically don't recommend blob. You can either use files or you can use a file server. So these are the two ones that we could use. Thank you for answering that question. We are setting up apps which need to be used, shared by multiple users. We don't have it installed on individual user. Works like, yes. So if you have an app, let's say something like MyOb, which is one of the popular apps that a lot of customers use. It's a client server based application. You can basically publish the app with the desktop, or you can, in the image which you create, the Windows 10 image, you can have the app installed on the image itself, so that whenever a new virtual desktop is created and when a user logs in, he has Office apps plus the MyOb app available on his Windows 10, and he can start using it from there. That is option one. Option two is you can publish your MyOb app so that it starts becoming available from the client itself, the remote desktop client itself. So both these two options are available. Depending on your choice, you can definitely use it. How do we work out the cost? Again, for costing, please get in touch with us with a little bit of more details. Now, do remember one of the differences, one of the major differences of Windows Virtual Desktop and traditional RDS is you don't need to consider the cost of all your other RDS roles. Like, for example, in the entire setup, you'd not see me setting up an RDS gateway, an RDS license server, a session broker, all these are all managed and maintained by Microsoft. All you need to worry about is the session host and what's the capacity of the session host. How do you monitor performance? That's a very good question. So in the upcoming sessions, we will be covering monitoring of Windows Virtual Desktop. Azure Monitor has facilities available where you can monitor in terms of your CPU utilization, resource utilization. You can even configure Azure load balancer so that you can distribute the incoming load to multiple servers. So all these options are available. Keeping time frame in mind, I not wanted to cover all of those in the single session, but in the upcoming sessions, we will be covering all those in much greater detail. So basically we need AD and Windows 10 to get it working. So for Windows Virtual Desktop, you definitely need an Active Directory infrastructure. Now this Active Directory infrastructure can be the Windows Active Directory, which I just demonstrated, or you could use Azure Active Directory domain services, which I'll be covering in the next session. Azure Active Directory domain services is more suitable for customers who are already using Office 365 and Microsoft 365, and they already have users synced to Azure Active Directory, right? So we can definitely, if you're interested, please join us next Wednesday, where I'll show you how do you configure, what's the benefit of it, how different is it than an Active Directory running on a VM, a virtual machine. Thanks, Zaki, for your feedback. When will the 30-day promo end? The 30-day promo is currently for April. So Philip, if you want to utilize it, please get in touch with us. We'll be more than happy to assist you. How does the pool licensing work? If you're talking about the Windows 10 licensing, each user should have a Windows 10 license. Now, if that user is using Microsoft 365, right, or if he has a Microsoft 365 license assigned, then he doesn't need any additional license apart from the normal Windows Virtual Desktop consumption. You're running a virtual machine, you're using storage, things like this on Azure, so you'll have a consumption bill, but apart from that, he doesn't need any other licensing. If your customer is using Office 365, then he'll have to purchase a Windows 10 subscription license and pay the Azure consumption cost. If an existing client of Office 365 Premium wishes to use, yeah, so this is a classic example, right? So if your customer is using Office 365 Business Premium, then he'll have to purchase Windows 10 subscription license and the Windows Azure consumption. So these are the two costing that will be part of his entire BOQ. Thanks, Robert, for answering that. If app needs high graphics, will Windows 10 support it? Answer is yes. So we have a lot of customers where I've personally deployed N-series virtual machines. These are virtual machines that use GPU or which have GPU in them. And you can pretty much run Revit, Autodesk, Adobe, Creative Cloud, things like this, right? Which they use for designing machineries, designing buildings. You can definitely do that. I suspect there's no restriction in terms of encryption, say BitLocker, etc. Yeah, so there is no restriction if it is a Windows 10 feature. So there's nothing. Where can we sign up for upcoming sessions? So the invite which you received has the option to sign up for the next 3 Wednesdays. So just click on it, add it to your calendar, and log in like you log in for this time. So those were all the questions which I see. I don't see any other questions popping up. If you do have any further questions, feel free to drop me an email. This is my email address. I'm more than happy to get in touch with you, answer any of your questions that you have. I hope the session was helpful. Hope the session was informative. The slides and the recording will be shared in the upcoming days. I can review it, and if you need any help setting up Windows Virtual Desktop, Ingram Micro team is more than happy to help you and support you. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining the session today. And hopefully we'll have a Windows Virtual Desktop tenants spun up in the near future. Thank you very much, and have a great day ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.